Welcome to this midweek program. I am talking about hardwood cuttings, but a very small subset of hardwood cuttings. When plants are propagated asexually from stem cuttings, we speak of the cuttings as either being softwood or hardwood cuttings or semi-hardwood cuttings. Softwood cuttings would be taken early in the growing season into about midsummer or maybe late summer. It's the not fully mature wood. When you get to, after you've had a frost and the wood is mature and is no longer growing, those are referred to as hardwood cuttings. Today I'm going to be talking about a limited number of plants that can be propagated in the easiest of all manner, where we just stick the stems directly in the ground or in a container. There are a lot of plants we do from hardwood cuttings in the winter that we do not do that way. Only the things that are easiest to root will tolerate this very simple treatment. The things like conifers and broadleafed evergreens like camellias and hollies and such, we stick those in very much the same manner that we would stick most cuttings all summer long, where they're smaller cuttings. We use a rooting compound on them, and we stick them in flats, and we put them on our mist bench. But the plants I'm talking about today are things you can just stick directly where you want them in the garden. One group of plants that tolerate this treatment are the shrubby dogwoods, especially the ones that are grown for their colorful twigs. The red twig dogwoods are the best known of this group of plants. The classic one is Cornus alba. There are many cultivars of Cornus alba. There are even yellow-stemmed versions of them. There's also many with various different variegated foliage combinations. The other most common of the colored twig dogwoods are the Cornus sericea. There's two very similar ones, Midwinter Fire, which is this one, and Midwinter Beauty. I think I have that name wrong. Midwinter Fire. No, there's two with Winter Beauty, I think, is the other one that's very similar. And there's several others in the nursery trade. Another one that is a very recent introduction is this one over here, which is a selection of the Silky dogwood, Cornus amomum. And I'll come back to that one later on and talk about it in more detail, but I want to just focus on this propagation technique right now. Winter Beauty? Yeah. Many of the willows that we grow as ornamentals also can be propagated in this manner. There's several different willows we grow for their catkins, the pussy willows. This is a Japanese species. The willows are Salix, and this is Salix chinomaloides. This is a species that J.C. Ralston promoted, 40 years ago or so. And, maybe you acquire it as cut stems from a farmer at the farmer's market or, from a florist or something. If they haven't been too dried out, you can stick them directly in the ground. Here it is. There are a number of willows that are grown for their colorful stems. This is one called Flame. It gets cut back every year, and all of this growth was produced this year. And there are a number of willows that are grown for their contorted stems. Two examples. This is one called Snake, or The Snake. It's fairly upright and narrow growing, so it doesn't take up as much room as the next willow I'm going to show you, which is, that's also This also has contorted stems, but this is essentially a weeping willow with contorted stems. There's several like this. Scarlet curls and swizzle stick are very similar cultivars, but this is the orientation it was on the tree, so pendant. And this becomes quite large, so if you're pressed for room, I would recommend snake over scarlet curls. And this is also an easier one to use in flower arrangements because these stems are pendant. It's hard to use those in most flower arrangements. And there are a number of, a couple edible plants that can be propagated in this manner. Figs can certainly be propagated from cuttings just stuck in the ground. And that's also a piece of fig. And so can pomegranates. Now, I've never tried pomegranates directly in the ground, but I have certainly taken dormant or hardwood cuttings in the wintertime and stuck them in pots and just left them in a unheated poly house, and they'll be rooted by spring. I've never tried, but I understand that blueberries can also be propagated in this manner. So what is the technique? Well, on things that are real easy, well, you have two options. One option would be to stick it in the ground exactly where you want the plant to be long term. The other option would be to stick it in a container. We have some pots here. You could stick it in a pot like that. This time of year, if you have display pots in the garden, you have probably filled it with winter vegetables and pansies and stuff. And if you need more height, you can take something like one of the red twig dogwoods, one of the colored twig dogwoods, or one of the willows, and just stick it in the ground when you plant the pot. And they will look great all winter, and by spring, most of the time they are rooted. So the technique is really just a matter of shoving it in the ground. If your soil is soft enough, you can, that's really all that's involved in this technique. Now, on the dogwoods, I probably might have better luck if I was using younger wood. This stem from here all the way up to there was produced last year, and most of this was produced last year as well, so I might make two cuttings out of that. And in the vein of nothing ventured, nothing gained, I probably still going to stick that older part of the stem, but we can stick these ones as well. I think you probably want at least 6 inches in the ground. And unless you're really short of material to stick in the ground, you might stick more than one stem in that location in case one roots and the other one doesn't. But that's all that's involved. With the willows are so easy to root that, even an older, well, this isn't all that old. The oldest part of the stem is maybe 2 years old, but I would stick whole stems this size in display pots, and they nearly always are rooted by spring. So with the willows, you can use much larger stems. With figs, now figs can be rooted using exactly this method where you stick it right in the garden where you want the plant to grow. But we also often stick cuttings in containers and either root them in an unheated house or root them with heat. And with heat, they'll root much quicker. But, either way, you're going to get a high degree of success. With the fig cuttings, I would use just, the wood that was produced last year. This cane was all produced last year, so I could use this whole length on this older stem. These little shoots here or last year's wood. So these 3 stems would be good for sticking either in the ground or in the container. You know, if you don't want to waste that, you could try sticking that as well. You know, if you're growing figs, you know how big they get, so you're probably not short of material. But this also could be a good way to add additional varieties. If you know somebody who has a fig variety that you don't have and you want, you know, maybe you can beg a stem from them. So about, on the fig, about foot length stems or so. Or the minimum size I would do would be 2 nodes, 1, 2 nodes. So when you stick the cutting, there's a node underground. Because on a fig, if we stuck the cutting without a node underground and it died to the ground, it might not be able to put up new growth from underground. So with most cuttings, I like 2 node cuttings as the minimum. So there's that backup node underground, which can become the new crown of the plant. So all it takes again is just shoving them in the ground. Now, these things aren't staying here, but you know, for the purpose of this demonstration. And if your ground is hard, you know, you can dig a hole and then stick the stems in. But left in place, they should be rooted by spring. One thing I do need to say is when you're sticking a cutting, it's really important, it's essential to maintain the right polarity, by which we mean, you know, top versus bottom of the stem. Once I cut this piece off, you might be wondering, well, which end is up? Well, it's essential that the cutting get stuck in the ground, so the bottom of the cutting is in the ground and it's not upside down. So, you know, keep that in mind when you're cutting a stem into shorter pieces. With this, we, you know, instantly know which end is up and which is down because of the way it's branched. But once we cut a piece like that, it's a little bit harder to know. You can look at the stem, and often the leaf scar is above the node, and so that would be up. That'd be up as opposed to when it's the other orientation and then the cutting's upside down. So it's a real simple technique with a high rate of success if you stick with these things that are really easy to do. I'm sure a lot of people in the audience have questions about, well, will it work with this and will it work with that? I'm happy to try to answer those questions later on in the program. But the main thing I would like to say is, you know, nothing ventured, nothing gained. So if you want to try something and you don't know whether or not it's something that would succeed using this simple method, just go ahead and try. You know, some of the hydrangeas that are easy to root would work. Some people succeed with Rose of Sharon. You know, and people certainly have long done hardwood cuttings of boxwoods, often fairly large cuttings. So, you know, just if you're curious about something, whether or not it succeed, then try. That's about all I have about this very simple technique. I would like, well, I know there's one other little side, little tip that I might share that's not related to propagation, but this willow, this pussy willow, the Salix chinomaloides, is just starting to bloom. You see the upper part of the stem, the catkins are still enclosed in the bud scale, and willows are distinct in that there's just one bud scale enclosing the bud. They're come off like a little dunce cap. And if you stick this in water, especially in the warmth of the house, the catkins will expand. But if you want them to stop at the perfect stage, well, that's the point, or a little bit before then, that you remove them from the water, because once they're no longer in water, the development will stop. And so once you've done that, they will look attractive for years. My grandparents always had a wall pocket with pussy willows in them, and there wasn't any water in that container, but the pussy willows looked the same for many, many years. If you left them in the water, the catkins are going to expand fully. They're going to be about the size of my finger. They're going to curve over, and they're going to turn yellow with all the stamens, at which point they're fairly unsightly. But stuck in water several weeks from now, these catkins will be sort of at the perfect stage for removing from the water, so their development stops at that point. Okay, and let's see. Oh, I stuck them in the ground. They haven't rooted yet. And there we go. All right, I mentioned Cornus alba is the classic red twig dogwood. It's really a plant of colder climates than the warm end of zone 7. And if you've been gardening for a while, you have probably bought a number of cultivars of Cornus alba, planted them. They might have looked good for a few years, and then they start to decline and maybe eventually entirely disappear from your garden. Cornus sericea, as in this selection, Midwinter Fire, is much more reliable in this warm climate. And so I highly recommend Cornus sericea cultivars. Cornus alba, try them. Some of them are a bit better than others. But what I really want to talk about is this third species. And as I mentioned earlier, this is Cornus amomum, the silky dogwood. And it's called silky dogwood because the new foliage and the new stems have very fine silky hairs on them. And the typical silky dogwood has purplish brown stems, but this is a new selection with reddish stems. And the cultivar, well, let me stop for a second, because it's one of these modern plants where actually the cultivar name is a usable one. The cultivar name is cayenne. I thought this was one of those plants that had both a cultivar name and a trademark name. But silky dogwood is a very widespread North American native, including the Southeast. And it's very well adapted to our warm summers. I regret that I'm standing in front of this specimen because it's about a year overdue for a hard pruning. And these, or a part of your garden that's too wet for a lot of other things. Now they are true dogwoods. They are in the genus Cornus, along with our flowering dogwood, Cornus florida. But most dogwoods do not have the large, I'll use the term petal, that the flowering dogwood does. They're actually modified bracts. So if you think of a flowering dogwood, it just has the little yellow flowers inside. Well, this has a head of small white flowers. Here's the old flower stalks right here, a head of flowers maybe 3 inches across, tiny white flowers that are moderately showy, but and pollinators would make use of those flowers, and when they fruit, the fruit is highly favored by birds. So these twiggy dogwoods, shrubby dogwoods also fit in a garden that's being planted for wildlife support. Cornus alba meaning white, gets that name because the fruit is white when it's mature. Cornus amomum, the fruit is blue when it's ripe. And they ripen mid to late summer. Probably never enough to be super showy, but the birds will find it and use it, and that's a satisfying thing. What else do I have to share on this topic? Just, do this at home, try it. I think you'll be pleased. I recommend if you're sticking them directly in the ground where you want them to grow, do a little research and find out how big these things get. Figs probably need to be 8 feet apart or more. These shrubby dogwoods, which you can cut back hard, certainly don't need to be that far apart. And the willows, depending on how you treat them or which variety you plant, some of them are much larger growing than others. And the pussy willows can be cut back hard every year once they're established, like the red twig dogwoods are cut back. Because then you'll get long, straight wands that are nice for flower arrangements. So I hope somebody...
Temperature range that this is better to be done, other than the convenience of the garden?
Lisa's question was, is there an ideal temperature range to do this? No, but this is something we do in winter, and I assume that a good part of the audience are from this area, and one day it'll be 75 degrees and the next day it'll drop down to 19. So there's no planning for that. You just do it any time from, late fall, early winter through the early winter months, and they should be rooted by spring. It might be the case that earlier in the winter is better than late in the winter, just so they have more time to root. I've never studied it. It just always seems to work.
So, Doug, we have oodles of questions
for
specific kinds of plants.
Sure.
And can they be done that way? And
sure.
I'm saving them up for just in a little bit. But we did have a good question from David. He said, is there a need to water? Do they need fertilizer when you're doing these from cuttings? And what are the soil preferences?
Good questions. We never fertilize cuttings while they're rooting. Unless the plant was starved. You probably shouldn't be taking cuttings off of starving plants because the cuttings aren't going to be good. But if the plant is of normal health, it won't need any additional fertilizer. Then, there's food stored up in the plant, and there should be enough available fertilizer in the soil. Soil types, whatever the plant would normally grow in. These are things that are super easy to root. So stick them where you want them to grow. And there was a third part to that question. Oh, what was the third part of it?
Fertilizer, soil, and water.
Oh, most winters you're not going to need to water these at all. We started off quite wet in the winter, quite dry in early winter, late fall. But now we've had a significant amount of rain, and the bigger difference is that with the cooler temperatures, once our soil gets moist in the winter, it tends to stay moist all winter. Now, perhaps the person who's asking these questions is gardening on sand, and then you might need to water them occasionally. But on a soil with any kind of clay in it, it's going to most winters stay adequately moist.
So we had going to the plant specifics now, Doug. I
Yeah.
hunt them down in all the chat because they're rather lengthy. I had a couple people ask about viburnums, and one specifically asked about leatherleaf viburnum. Any luck with any viburnums doing them this way?
I've never tried viburnums this way. Most of the plants I've done using this method are the ones I've already shown today. So
that's what I thought.
And I will take all these questions, but I do want to reiterate something I've already said, which is, nothing ventured, nothing gained. So Give it a try. In parts of the country with really cold climate, sometimes cuttings are collected in the fall or early winter and stored like in a refrigerated and then stuck in late winter, early spring.
And it could be some of these might root one year and not another year.
Well, yeah.
So, like you said, give it a try, see what
Yeah.
happens. But a lot of viburnums, as far as I can know, are done with softwood cuttings like in May and June, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's see what else we have. Nancy, yes, the Japanese maple grafting workshop is an in-person workshop. We also have a deciduous conifer grafting workshop later in March, and that's also in person too. How about Vitex, Doug? I was wondering if Vitex could be that way. Someone asked.
I've not tried, but
Give it a try?
we always have. I would try. Yeah,
Okay.
just try.
Okay. I'm just going through the questions.
I read.
Cotinus. Any luck with cotinus? Again, I think those are softwood cuttings, aren't they?
My experience with cotinus is it's very hard to root, and so I would think softwood cuttings tend to root more readily than hardwood cuttings. And cotinus is hard to root from softwood cuttings. I wouldn't think, but again, try.
Carol asked about doing this with bay leaf shrub, and bay leaf aren't deciduous. There should be evergreen. If it is leafless, it's probably dead.
I don't know. We certainly root bay, the culinary bay, Laurus nobilis, summer and winter, but using rooting hormones. Some of these, the things the examples I have today are all things that are real easy to root. And because they are so easy to root, we do not use rooting hormone. But any of these ones that people are asking about that might be more difficult to root, use some rooting hormone on them before you stick them in the ground, and maybe that would make a difference.
Yeah, Doug's mostly talking today about the really easy to root ones.
Yeah, and going back to the bay, the culinary bay, and evergreen viburnums, one thing you need to deal with as a hardwood cutting stuck in the ground outside is desiccation over winter. Several generations ago, before we had modern rooting techniques and chemicals and stuff, people often stuck broadleaf evergreen cuttings in a coal frame that was covered to keep the humidity up. But I would think that a broadleaf evergreen stuck in the ground out in the open, like I'm proposing doing with these deciduous plants, would probably desiccate before it rooted.
I would think so. So Marilyn has a slightly different question. So we're going to ask because I like it. Marilyn asked, do the roots come out where the buds are, so that you should make sure that you have buried some buds, or do they grow at the bottom cut end? And Marilyn, that's a little bit of both. The buds are a location of a lot of cellular division activity. So a lot of the roots will come from where the buds are. So you definitely, if you want really good success, have some buds below ground. And for some of the plants, not the ones that Doug's talking about today, but like a herbaceous hibiscus, you want to have buds below ground because everything above the ground dies. And if you don't have a bud below ground, you have a nice rooted stick with no ability to grow a new shoot in the spring. So it's usually typically encouraged to have some buds below ground.
Yeah, and
Comments on that, Doug?
yeah, and I made the point earlier that with something like a fig, which if we had a cold winter, and it's been a long time since we've had a really cold winter, but I remember winters in this area when it was cold enough for figs to die to the ground. And so if it was a young plant and it, if it was a cutting stuck in the ground and it didn't have a bud underground, it might not be able to put up any new growth from underground. So having a bud underground is good insurance in case the plant ever died to the ground. Maybe somebody who got a little bit careless with the lawnmower ran over the cuttings you just stuck, or maybe the deer ate them to the ground. So if there's a bud under the ground, it has the ability to put up new shoots. Most plants they can't put up new shoots from the inner node, just from the node. And the node is what we're talking about having underground.
Yeah, most plants can make adventitious roots. They can't make adventitious buds. And adventitious means it's growing it from a plant part that's not already that plant part. So they can generate a root from part of the stem, but they can't generate a bud from where a bud doesn't already exist. Garish says he's going to try to do some saucer magnolias this winter. I don't think that's going to be terribly successful. How about you, Doug?
I agree with you, Chris.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of the magnolias are hard to root.
They're difficult to root. I think better off doing with grafting.
Yeah, many of them are grafted.
Yeah. So those can be rather difficult to do, unfortunately. But here's one that I think could be very successful, your method, Doug. Deborah's asking about beautyberry. I think you can probably put those readily in the ground and have those root.
Again, it's something that's real easy to root in the summer, so it might root in the winter, sure.
I sometimes use my beautyberry sticks to hold up the plastic. I use dry cleaner bags for humidity chambers, and I put the beautyberry sticks in there just to hold the plastic up, and those little buggers root. And I actually purposely put them in upside down, so they're not very successful, and they still root. So that's why I was thinking those actually might be worth the try. The next one is Catherine asked about hamamelis, and that's another plant, Catherine, that's really best done with grafting. That one's very difficult to root, if not impossible. Any comments, Doug, on that one?
I fully agree with Chris as far as the fancy hybrids. Sometimes you can root, but then there's very low survival of the cuttings that are rooted. One of our natives, the Ozark witch hazel hamamelis vernalis, which is in full bloom now, will root fairly well from summer cuttings. But no, most your fancy hybrids, all those named ones, I could probably bet money that they would not root stuck in the ground this time of year.
Yep. The next one's an interesting one, and I really can't remember all that was said about it, but I remember you talking about it with some, at least I think I remember it was you. Betsy is asking about Ficus carica Jolly Tiger. She commented that she stuck a bunch of cuttings from hers, and they all just came up green, and Jolly Tiger is a variegated one. And now she's just doing them via air layering cuttings. There shouldn't be any big difference in those. I'm just wondering, is that one of the plants that when it's young and in a pot and how you fertilized just doesn't show its variegation?
Jolly Tiger is a highly variegated form of the common culinary fig, Ficus carica. It is a very unstable variegation in that probably 3/4 of the stems that it puts up have no variegation. They're all green. So I'd be reluctant to take cuttings from it this time of year because I wouldn't know whether the stem I was taking was variegated or not. I have to think that if you took a stem this time of year and it was variegated in the summer, I would say it should definitely be variegated once it roots.
Yeah. So they always mark them in the summer.
Yeah.
With a little marker of some kind and just propagate those individual stems.
Yeah. Now, the Arboretum had a plant of Jolly Tiger, and it is a plant that many people go crazy over and just have to have. And so probably every time it put out a variegated stem, somehow that stem went home with somebody. And so we were left eventually with a plant with no variegation at all. And so we removed it because I think its loss of variegation was permanent. Now, through the generosity of a member, we now have the plant again, but probably won't plant it in the Arboretum, just have plants for sale periodically. But it's a fun one. It's highly variegated, and the fruit is striped too if they're produced on the variegated part of the plant.
So here's a slightly different question, Doug. Carolyn's asking, can you root the pussy willows that you purchase in stores? Yes and no.
Well, all right. I could say yes and no. Yes, if they're still alive. Yep. Maybe they've already been dried out, and a lot of cut flowers and pussy willows flower. Are many, many weeks old before they actually end up in somebody's vase at home because they've been kept in cold storage. So that's certainly worth a try. Now, I would say go to your local farmer's market. A lot of small-scale farmers grow cut flowers, and I used to live in Durham, and at the Durham Farmers Market, there were 2 or more farmers who, along with their collard greens and potatoes, sold cut stems of pussy willow and red twig dogwoods. And those were probably just as fresh as can be.
Yeah.
Probably cut them the day before.
I said yes and no because you can readily buy pussy willows as dried stems, and there's no bringing those back.
And the artificial pussy willows, the plastic ones, I've tried rooting them and never had any success. So just don't even try.
Oh, I'd be scared if you did have success, Doug. Just trying to find some more questions in here. There we go. That's 9-bark. Catherine was asking about 9-bark. Is that one you can do with cutting like this? I'm kind of thinking that one might be.
You know, it'd be worth a try.
Yeah.
And again, you know, take the nice strong stem from last year's wood, not no gnarly little slender twigs. So there's a lot of food in that stem. That's also a shrub that would readily root wherever a stem touched the ground, which is one of the forms of layering.
Yeah. Mary asked a good question, which I did answer in the chat, but I think it might be worth repeating. She says, when you cut a plant to the ground, exactly how high would you leave the stems?
Exactly?
Exactly. Be precise, Doug. Down to the millimeter.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding, everybody.
3.25 millimeters.
Ooh,
Yeah.
That's kind of short to the ground. You're blaming the ground, don't you?
Well,
I commented you just want to have a few buds above ground for the plant to grow back from, which can be just a few inches.
it's not an exact science. You know, I teach a renewal pruning class every spring here, or late winter, and you know the way you prune is based partly on whether things bloom on new wood or old wood, and things that bloom on new wood, like beautyberries and hydrangea paniculata, but not other hydrangeas, you can cut them to the ground in the winter, and they're still going to flower and fruit that same growing season. And so, you know, whenever I say cut it to the ground, at least one people will say, "Do you mean to the ground?" And so I will stand in front of them and cut a beautyberry to the ground. And, you know, the acuminata down here, the Mexican beautyberry down here, I do that every year, because otherwise it's way too big for its location. And it, you know, cutting to the ground, it still gets as tall and covers itself in fruit. So
when I cut mine to the ground, I typically leave about 4 or 6 inches, but that probably is overkill right there.
Well,
probably ample buds to grow back
yeah,
from.
no, it depends on the thing.
Yeah.
You know, it's not the way I would normally treat a rose, but if a rose has gone many, many years without any pruning and has accumulated a huge amount of dead wood in it, you could spend a whole day pruning out all the old and just leaving the new. But you know, it's perfectly all right for a shrub like that to cut it back really hard. And I probably wouldn't cut a rose to the ground, but maybe down to 5-6 inches or so.
And we had a private message about doing crepe myrtle this way. I think that one might be a possibility.
I'm glad that crepe myrtle came up, because though I've not tried it, I did read that crepe myrtles can be done from stem cuttings this time of year. Of course, you can also do crepe myrtles from root cuttings.
Oh, definitely from root cuttings.
Yeah.
Trish is wondering about pawpaws, Doug.
I just don't know about pawpaws. Well, pawpaws are usually, the cultivars are usually grafted, aren't they?
They were grafted, but don't pawpaws kind of shoot around too at the base?
Pawpaws are they spread underground like this dogwood is. Well, this dogwood is also rooting where the stems touch the ground. The fact that pawpaws are the named cultivars are generally grafted makes me think that it wouldn't root readily, but they do. They form colonies of stems in the wild or on their own because they spread underground.
Since they form a colony, that might be the best way to propagate it. Just dig some of the shoots up.
Well, they would be the understock.
Yeah, that's true.
The one thing I might do with a pawpaw this isn't something you would do in all situations, but sometimes if something is propagated by grafting and you want to get it on its own root, you can plant it deeper so the graft union is underground, and then the scion, the desirable part, would have a chance to make its own root system. Of course, sometimes plants are grafted up high, and this stem is not grafted, but I'm using it as an example. Let's say the graft union was here where my fingers are. You don't want to plant this another 4 inches deep if your soil is poorly drained, but you could always plant it at an angle so the graft union is below ground. And for something like the pawpaw, then maybe the scion, the desirable cultivar, is suckering rather than the understock.
So we had a triple plant question over here, Doug.
What is
not
a
just
triple
one, but
question?
Triple. And one of them I think is definitely not via this method. Camellia is one of them, butterfly bush, and also forsythia. And I bet you butterfly bush and forsythia might be definitely good ones to try.
I would think they would both succeed. Camellias are probably just as commonly rooted as softwood cuttings in the summer as hardwood cuttings in the winter.
But those are evergreen, and as you mentioned earlier, might desiccate via this method, because we're doing a no-nonsense method, putting a stick in the ground and not watering it. Yeah. But leaves that are just going to dry out a little bit too fast for the camellia.
Yeah, if your grandparents or great-grandparents were gardeners and southerners, they might have rooted camellias by cutting a stem, sticking it in the ground, like on the shady side of the garage, but putting a glass jar over it so it has a little greenhouse. So that's a similar method to what we're discussed today, but again, being an evergreen plant, needs you have to prevent it from being desiccated during the time it doesn't have roots.
Okay, great. And we have an interesting question, Doug. There's been a little bit of side talk about Rose of Sharon in here, about them seeding around, being invasive in the gardens because of that. And Ula was just asking, can you actually propagate the sterile Rose of Sharon? And of course, with the Rose of Sharon, they have stems, they root readily, so you can asexually reproduce the sterile Rose of Sharons and any other plant that will grow from a cutting. That's asexually, so that's without growing them from seed. So yes, you can. You just won't be able to get any seedlings off of them because they are sterile. Any additions to that, Doug?
I just want to emphasize the fact that there are Rose of Sharon selections that were bred to be sterile, because though their seedlings don't seem to get spread far and wide, if you grow an old-fashioned fertile Rose of Sharon, you'll have carpets of seedlings underneath them. And, maybe one of the first plants that was bred for sterility was Rose of Sharon, because I guess it was the National Arboretum or the USDA introduced 4 or 5 sterile Rose of Sharons 40 years or more ago. They were named for, I guess, Greek goddesses, Diane, Minerva, Aphrodite, and Helen. That's 4. There might be a 5th one. They are all very beautiful. They had larger than normal flowers and did not make seed, or if they made any seed at all, it was very, very few. Now, those are all really hard to find in the nursery trade nowadays, but there are a lot of newer cultivars, and some of them have been bred for sterility as well. And before you buy them, you might need to do a little research to determine if they are truly sterile, but there are a lot of really beautiful selections. And I'm a really big fan of Rose of Sharon because it's blooming for many, many months in the summer, through the worst parts of hot, humid summer, and they just look flawless. So it's a great ornamental in the summer garden.
People are talking about pollinator gardens, and I can remember yellow swallowtails on them all the time.
Okay.
Oh, that's a great one. Here's a good question from Tara. Surprisingly, not about an individual plant. Can we expect flowering and fruiting this season? In other words, from the ones you've just propagated from the stem cuttings.
Well, figs are so precocious, I would imagine so.
Probably not a lot, but
Yeah,
some.
they'd be small. They're all going to, but they'll be rooted by spring, and they should, grow away quite quickly. Most of the things I showed today are things that aren't grown for flowers or fruiting. While the pussy willow will flower, the other willows and the colored twig dogwoods are, their ornamental features are colored stems. And
so the one thing to note, Tara, is when you're propagating a plant like this, you'll be propagating an adult plant and you'll be skipping the juvenile phase. So if you grew these plants from seed, they might take 2, 3, 4, even more years to start flowering. But something like this, once it attains a decent size, they should flower. So if it doesn't do it this year, it could readily do it the following year. So you should have a flowering plant much faster. I had a private message here, Doug, about propagating roses this way. And before we were even online, I mentioned to Doug that I propagated a rose. I had one, or I actually have one. In fact, I think it's the one I rooted, called China Doll. And I pruned my plant back in Texas, stuck them in the ground. I kind of did it jokingly, and they rooted. It was a relatively moist spring in Texas. Doug mentioned or talked about rooting in sand, and our soil back in Texas was pure sand. And it was luckily a moist, cool spring, and the roses rooted. I used no rooting hormone, just stuck naked stems in the ground, and they turn into roses. So you can. A lot of the roses are grafted, so you might need to take that in consideration. Anything else to add to that, Doug?
yeah, your repeat blooming roses generally root a lot more easily, a lot more readily than the once blooming roses, like the old European albas and gallicas and stuff. They sort of go into a completely mature and hard to root wood once they're completed their bloom cycle, whereas the ones that continue blooming all through the summer generally root quite readily. It's as if they remain in a more juvenile stage and root more readily. I thought of one plant that we had success in rooting last year from hardwood cuttings taken while they were dormant and leafless is our Eminopterus.
Mm-hmm.
Eminopterus is a tree that JC introduced from China. And if you know our native Pinknea, maybe we should try Pinknea, the fever bark tree native to the southeast. They have small white flowers, but then they have big, in Pinknea, usually pink, and in Eminopterus, white bracts. They remind me a lot of poinsettias, little flowers in the center and big bracts. And our Eminopterus trees are almost visible from here, but they're probably 60 feet tall, but they do sucker. And Tim took, that very lush shoots from the suckers and stuck them, and we had a good rate of rooting on those.
It's getting a little late, everyone, and it looks like the questions are coming in faster than we're keeping up with them. Just to let everyone know that since I last went down to the bottom, we have 51 new comments. So they're coming in very quickly. And Doug, we actually had almost 300 people in today's group.
Oh my goodness! Wow,
a pretty good number. People want to know how to propagate their plants. But we do have a couple really good questions that I think might be worth highlighting. Because if you have a specific question about can this plant be propagated, a very simple Google search will definitely give you some good results. So I don't want to force you to do that, but I have a feeling I can get to a lot more questions. But Val had a neat question that I think even just removing the plant name in there would still be worth answering. And her question was, can you start fringe tree cuttings with the water shoots? And I think that might be a neat one just to change just the question. Can you plant or can you propagate these plants from the water shoots? And that just involves the cutting type or the placement on the plant from the cutting. And the water shoots are usually more juvenile-ish, if you can call it that way. They're just a nice, good location to take cuttings from. They usually don't have the flowers on them. They're not more adult. So there often is more success rooting from the water shoots. Any comments on that, Doug?
No, I would agree with that.
And water shoots are often at the base of the plant and more shaded, and that also adds to the success of the plant. But if you took the cuttings from the tops, that might be stems that have the flowers on them, and those are quite often the cuttings you want to avoid. And Wayne asked, and I know you highlighted it just a little bit, but I think it deserves just emphasis again. Might using hormones improve all or almost any of the plants, even with this method?
It would certainly should improve the ones that are slightly difficult to root. It might improve even these easier things, or maybe it would happen more quickly, but if your success rate with these easy things is already close to 100%.
Why bother?
Yeah, yeah.
Just in case anyone here doesn't know it, willow was one of the plants that they used to make something called willow tea out of. And they would dip other plants into the willow tea for rooting. And that would help the other plants that were harder to root. And it turned out that they were just a great source for the native auxins. So they already have a good amount in them for rooting. And of course, they're also the source for aspirin too. But it is 4 o'clock. I think this might be a very good time to end. We now have 63 unread comments. So I'm sorry that looks like we can't quite get to them. We've already used an hour of our allotted time. These programs for the Gardening 101 are supposed to be a little bit shorter programs, so we don't occupy too much time. I hope I'm sorry we couldn't get to it, but if it's a pending question, you can't find your answer in Google search, just send us an email and we'll do our best to answer the questions via that method. Any final concluding comments, Doug?
Try it.
Yeah.
You can go out and stick some cuttings in the ground.
And we've even learned that lesson here in our propagation workshops. People ask us if they can root a particular thing under more ideal conditions in our greenhouse in a mist, and we may not have a good answer for it, and the answer is always to give it a try. And I know we've learned a few things, and we've added a few plants to our propagation because we've learned from them that, yeah, they can be done that way. So give it a try. It's always worth experimenting with. But we're so happy that you could join us out here today, out here in the garden, learning how to propagate plants from hardwood cuttings during the winter. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you so much, Doug, for helping us out with that. And thanks to Lise and also Alexander for their filming abilities. And glad you can join us. Hope to see you again next week, either here in person with the programs or, of course, online as usual. Thanks, everyone. See you all later.
Bye.
Thank you.